Hello, hello. These times are changing notes, and these are all about early 1800s change. First up, the fun of industry. Now, in the early 1800s, methods of transportation and manufacturing goods changed the way people lived and worked. So, transportation changes and manufacturing changes changed the way people live. In an effort to improve roads, some states started taking money on turnpikes, with the country's lone decent road being the national road, and it was managed by the federal government. So in an effort to improve roads, they start building turnpikes. They start taking some of that paper on turnpikes. And the only really decent road in the country was the national road, which was managed by the feds. And if you want to know more about the national road, there you go. Now, the steamboat made transportation on water faster, and it unlocks the greatness and the potential of the Mississippi. So the steamboat made transportation on water faster and unlocks the greatness of the Mississippi. And if you want to know more about the steamboat, there you go. Now, canals were built in the early 1800s in the Northeast sections and the Midwest. The most big-time canal connected the Hudson River with the Erie Canal, or with the Atlantic Ocean, connected the Hudson River with the Great Lakes. And it's called the Erie Canal. Now, the Erie Canal also makes New York an industrial center. So the Erie Canal is what makes New York big time. And if you want to know more about the Erie Canal, there you go! Now, railroads began in the U.S. in the 1820s. Railroads cost less to build than ships. They moved faster than ships, and they could carry more weight, so they were awesome. So railroads began in the U.S. in the 1820s. They cost less to build than a ship, they moved faster than a ship, and they could carry more weight, which made them awesome! Want to know more about railroads in the U.S.? There you go. Now, in 1793, Sam Slater sneaks out of England. Yes, he snuck out of England and builds the first water-powered textile mill in the U.S. So, 1793, Sam Slater sneaks out of England and he builds the first water-powered textile mill in the U.S. If you want to know more about Samuel Slater, there you go. And there you go again. Now, after touring England's factories in 1813, Francis Cabot Lowell opens a fully operational mill where all aspects of clothes are made. And if you want to know more about Francis Cabot Lowell, there you go. Now, with the opening of factories, work life changes, production speeds up, labor's divided, and jobs required less skill. So with the opening of factories, work life changed, production sped up, labor's divided, and jobs required less skill and training. Now, on to Eli Whitney. Well, we all know one of the things that Eli Whitney introduces, but Eli Whitney was also one of the first people to introduce interchangeable parts, and he did it on muskets. So if a musket breaks, you don't have to get a whole new musket. You can actually use the one you got and just change out the part. If you want to know more about good old Eli, there you go. And there you go again. Now, in 1832, Sam Morse invented the electric telegraph, and that's the little thing where you go. So in 1832, Sam Morse invented the electric telegraph. Want to know more about him? There you go. And there you go again. Now, in 1793, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. The cotton gin actually increases the need for slavery because what the cotton gin does is it gets the seeds out of the cotton. But when you get the seeds out of the cotton, you still got to have somebody pick the cotton, and so it increases the need for slavery. And there's some more on the cotton gin. All right, so this is the moves and all about reform movements. So the expansionist movement in the 1820s started looking at Mexico because Mexico had become independent from Spain, and America saw this as a land for new opportunity. So the expansionist movement in the 1820s started looking at Mexico because they became independent from Spain, and Americans saw this as an opportunity. The expansionist movement started using the term known as manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is actually the belief that God wanted the United States to own all of North America. Yes, that's right. They believed God wanted the United States to own all of North America. And if you want to know more about manifest destiny, go! Now, many attributed all the bad stuff in the United States to alcohol. So temperance meant drinking in moderation. And the temperance movement won some success in the 1850s when they get some of the laws changed in the states about alcohol. So the temperance movement had some success in the 1850s when they get alcohol laws passed in some states. If you want to know more about the temperance movement, there you go. All right, so abolition. Abolition, with the growth of slavery, the cotton industry grew. And so did opposition to slavery in the abolition movement. Abolition is the opposition to slavery, and we will talk a lot more about that. I just wanted to touch on it here later. So there's the abolitionist movement. Another movement of the early 1800s, in the education reform movement. In the early 1800s, reformers began pushing for public school systems funded by taxes. That's why you're here. And it started with the Horace Mann in Massachusetts in 1837. So the education reform movement to have public schools funded by taxes started in 1837 with the Horace Mann in Massachusetts. And if you want to read more about the Horace Mann, there you go. Now on to the women's movement. Now, in the early 1800s, women began to change the role that they had in society by being involved with religious and abolitionist movements. So in the early 1800s, women began to change the role they had in society by being involved in religious and abolitionist movements. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others organized the Seneca Falls Convention for Women. So in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others organized the Seneca Falls Conference. If you want to know more about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, there you go. And there you go again. Now, at Seneca Falls, they adopt a Declaration of Sentiments on Women's Rights. But really, this brings about no changes because it had no power of law. So they adopt the Declaration of Sentiments on Women's Rights, but really it brought about no changes because it did not have the power of law. Stanton continued to fight for improvements, though, and she gained some improvements in property rights in New York. If you want to read about the Seneca Falls Conference, there you go. The Declaration of Sentiments, and on to the Jackson. This is the age of Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson got beat up in the election of 1824 by a man named John Quincy Adams. Yes, he is related to John Adams. This was his son. And he then becomes a symbol of democracy by projecting himself as the down-to-earth common man. So Jackson gets beat in the election of 24, but then he becomes the down-to-earth common man. And in many ways he was. He's really the first president who was not an aristocrat. Jackson wins the election of 1828 because he portrayed himself that way. And if you want to know more about Andrew Jackson, there you go. And here's some more. Now, Jackson promised to return to strong state governments and a weak federal government. He also promised he would not interfere in slavery. So Jackson promised to return to strong state governments and a weak federal government. And he promised he wouldn't get involved in slavery. Jackson also pushed to change new party structure. He organized state and local branches. He had tight party discipline, and he rewarded loyalists to him with government jobs. So he had the spoils system. All right, so when Jackson came to office, he'd been working for years for the Native Kick-Out. After his election, he did what he wanted, and he signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830. Whoops. And if you want to know more about the Indian Removal Act of 1830, there you go. Now, the Indian Removal Act, one of the first ways it was really used was the Cherokee removal in Georgia. And this is what the forcible removal of the Cherokees was what was known as the Trail of Tears. So one of the first ways the Indian Removal Act was used was with the Trail of Tears and the removal of Cherokee Indians out of Georgia. And if you want to know more about the Trail of Tears, there you go. There you go again! Now, after the War of 1812, the U.S. government implemented new tariffs in 1916, 1928, and 1932 in an effort to aid northern businesses. So after the War of 1812, the U.S. government implemented new tariffs in 1916, 28, and 32 in an effort to aid northern businesses. Now the South said, heck no to those tariffs, because it raised prices on goods, and it meant the Brits could not pay as much for their cotton. So the South said, heck no to those tariffs, because it raised prices on goods, and the British wouldn't pay for their cotton anymore. So on November of 1828, there's a picture of the Supreme Court here, but it should be South Carolina. South Carolina declares this law null and void, and stated that if the U.S. government tried to get the tax, the state of South Carolina would secede. So it's one of the first real threats of secession. So in November of 1828, South Carolina says, we are not going to follow this law. It is null and void. And states, if the U.S. government tries to come get that tax, we're going to secede. Now, Jackson tries to get a bill through Congress that allowed him to force payment, but it stalled. And the crisis ends with the compromise tariff of 1833. So Jackson tried to get a bill through Congress that would allow him to force payment, but the bill stalled, and the crisis ends with the compromise of 1833. And if you want to know more about the nullification crisis, there she goes. Now, one of the only other things that is really big about the Jackson administration, Congress passed the charter for the Second Bank of the U.S. in 1816. Jackson opposed the Second Bank of the U.S. because he saw it as being for special interest and that it favored the rich. So he opposes the charter to the Second Bank of the U.S. because he thought it was full of special interests and it favored the rich. Now, in 1832, Congress voted to renew the charter, but Jackson vetoed it with the Second Bank supporters actually going and forming their own party called the Whig Party in response. So in 32, Congress voted to renew the charter of the Second Bank. Jackson vetoes it, and the Second Bank supporters, they actually go form their own political party called the Whigs. Now in 32, Jackson wins re-election by a landslide, and he withdraws federal funds from the bank, which really weakens the economy. So Jackson gets what he wants, he closes the bank, but it really weakens the economy.